Welcome to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. I'm your host, Rafe Kelley. At Evolve, Move, Play, our aim is to help you cultivate a more meaningful life and a more heroic self by reconnecting deeply to movement, mindfulness, nature, and community practices. This podcast was created to bring the best and brightest minds in all of these subjects together to better understand how we can create an empowering and sustainable ecology of practices for personal growth. If you're interested in being part of this ongoing conversation, the best way you can support us and get involved is by joining our Podcast Plus membership. By joining, you will get backstage access to our live podcast airing once a month, as well as a private question and answer session with me and our guests after the show. On top of that, you'll get access to our thriving online community where you can continue these deeper discussions with people all over the world who are just as passionate and curious about these topics as you. More details about the membership, as well as the link to get signed up, are in the description below. And whether you can join, be sure to like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you can be notified every Monday when our episodes drop. Thanks so much for your support, and we hope you enjoy the show. Hey guys, welcome back to the Evolve, Move, Play podcast. This week, my guest is Sevilla King. Sevilla King runs a YouTube channel herself called Equality of Existence. And on that YouTube channel, she explores the connection between the works of folks like Jordan Peterson, my friend John Vervaeke, Jonathan Pageau, who've also had on this channel, with the works of Robert Pirsig, who's the author of a really famous book called Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So this book explores what Pirsig would come to call the metaphysics of quality, which is a fascinating idea that deeply aligns with something like Vervaeke's relevance realization. And of course, you know, what so many of these thinkers are talking about in the sense of meaning. It's a deep exploration. And in preparation for this conversation, I read 70% of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I was hoping to finish it, but I didn't quite get there before we had the talk scheduled. But it's really awesome to spend some time digging deep into Robert Pirsig's thought and then to get a chance to unpack it and connect it to all the ongoing conversations in the meaning community with Sevilla. Sevilla's had conversations with Paul van der Klee and Jonathan Pageau and John Vervaeke. So we share a lot of common ground in trying to map what's going on here. So it's a really fun conversation, diving deep into, well, what does Pirsig mean by quality? How does it align with Vervaeke's model? How does it align with Peterson's model? How does it align with Pageau's model? And where are those are actually in conflict, and how do we resolve those conflicts? So if you're interested in those questions, I highly recommend sticking around and joining my conversation with Sevilla King. Sevilla, welcome to the channel. It's a pleasure to get to speak with you.
You too, right?
Paul van der Klee recommended we talk a long time ago, and I know you've been kind of one of the personalities in this corner of the internet, which I think is your phrase for the conversations that are ongoing. You've been on with John Vervaeke and Paul van der Klee and Jonathan Pageau. So folks I've also had the chance to speak to and gotten a lot out of. And we both got interested, I think, in Jordan Peterson's work around the same time. Can you tell me when you really started digging into his work?
Sure, and I'll give you kind of how it happened.
Yeah.
So I was looking for something. I'm a therapist, so I was studying certain people. One of those people was Viktor Frankl, and I was also getting interested in Jung. So with those two search terms. Mm-hmm. Meaning and Jung, I came across Peterson, and just one lecture, and this was of course in 2015, where he was not famous at all. It was
before the CC blow up,
which was really amazing to see happen before my eyes, because I'd already been following him for a couple of years. So that was a very weird day when that happened. I mean, I think that was 2016. So I had been listening to his lectures, and I was totally hooked. I mean, he was just such a, I don't even need to explain. And right about that time, I was getting interested in some of these types of things. And Peterson had this notion, that the world is made of meaning. Mm-hmm. And he has a very early video from 2013 that explains that. And he actually has mentioned this. He's explained it in the same way. And it comes up frequently, the world is meaning, it's a dropping off place, et cetera. That's come up in the last. Did you see the Bishop Barron?
I did, yeah. Yeah. Will be another rich source for us to dig into.
Yeah. So so that, for some reason, when I was exploring that concept, and he hadn't put Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance on his reading list yet, I don't think. I had it around and I'd meant to read it. And so there was some kind of suggestion that concept was kind of broadened by, or the same type of concept that Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. So I read that. And of course became totally hooked, because this was all coinciding, this way of seeing reality described in that book, and that Peterson was describing, and that is kind of, percolating in this corner, and very much manifesting in this corner at this point, was just became very interesting to me. So I was so hooked on Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance that about 6 months after studying it and reading it and rereading it, I started that channel in order to kind of force myself to put some discipline into trying to understand it. Because if I had to present things, then I had to be at least partially coherent, even if, I couldn't get it all right to start with. And I still don't have it all right. I mean, it's a very simple metaphysics, but implementation can be pretty difficult, especially in the moral levels. So yeah, that's how I started the channel, and just here I am.
It's very cool. Excuse me for 1 second. So you went from Peterson to Pirsig. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting also that you're part of the pre-C16 generation. I was just after the C16 thing that I got into Peterson. My first encounter with him was on Joe Rogan, right? So that was, I think, maybe a month after.
Right, that was directly after.
Yeah, it was very, very, very soon after. And, he had 10,000 followers before that happened, which is actually quite a lot on YouTube. Mm-hmm. But it's still, not an internet celebrity. So I'm curious a little bit about your background as a therapist. Has that been your career path, since the beginning, or is it something that came into later? And why was it that you were seeking something that Peterson had to offer when you came across his channel?
Well, I was, no, I can't. I became a therapist I started all that process about 10 years ago. Okay. So, it's a second career for sure. I was an antiques dealer and art restorer before that. Okay. And so I was just really trying to get some concepts, and I happened upon Viktor Frankl. Do you know that?
I'm familiar. I haven't read Man's Search for Meaning yet. It's definitely on my reading list, but I haven't got there yet.
Well, the premise is that you have, it's about free will, basically. It says in the worst of circumstances, you have a choice to make the best possible decision. And it's all about him being in the concentration camp and absolutely being completely hopeless. And that if you have something to live for, even if it's a long shot, because the chances of them getting out of there in the best case scenario was 20% for the ones who are really resilient. Mm-hmm. But if you hold on to this meaning, if you hold on to this thing that you're living for, this is going to improve your odds, and it's going to make things better for whatever circumstance you're in. And then he was freed. He was only in for a year, and he came to America and started, logotherapy, which is based on meaning and choice. And
logotherapy?
Yeah.
I hadn't heard that term before.
Frankl uses logos as a as a substrate of his therapy, which is meaning. I mean, from this corner that the term logos is so, we're continually trying to understand what it means. And some people have a very concrete idea, especially the folks in the religious space. And then the rest of us kind of, try to figure it out on our own terms. And so that's how he used it.
So he used it as a synonym for meaning.
A synonym for meaning, yeah.
Interesting. So, okay. And so you found Frankl and Jung, and then we're looking for somebody to really get a deeper understanding of those approaches. Have you found that? I'm curious. Have you found that fruitful in your therapeutic practice, like bringing in these Petersonian ideas, or the stuff that he's brought together, and his predecessors like Frankl? Because obviously Frankl, what you're saying is very, you can see it has a direct link to the world as described by Peterson.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the idea of being able to make a choice in your life, because a lot of people, who seek therapy don't feel like they have any choices. And Peterson, that it's a lot of what he's talking about is methods that he's used to help people, get yourself established in certain ways, but the sense of responsibility, the sense that you have agency in the world if you make the decision to implement that agency. I think it's such a powerful idea. I mean, it's like it hasn't been so popular, but yeah.
It's funny. There's a few different directions that branch off of that, but cognitive behavioral therapy is something that's been really interesting to me, and I mean and a lot of what it is, as my understanding, is essentially helping people get rid of cognitive distortions that make them focus on things that are outside of their control, instead of focusing on the things that they control, which is basically Stoicism, right? It's the ancient philosophy of Stoicism. And I actually think that parkour is kind of like, it's an embodied cognitive behavioral therapy, right? It's a way of going into the world and intentionally cultivating the capacity to have options and to know how to choose them and to become somebody who can make choices, and who can recognize the truth, and who can take responsibility for their actions. So go ahead.
Elaborate on parkour a little bit more in that framework.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, you may have heard me talk about this, but when I first found Peterson, I'd been doing parkour for maybe 13, 12 years at that point. It's hard to tell the timeline anymore. I think about 12 years. And I was a teacher. I'd been teaching parkour since the very beginning. And I had started teaching my own method of movement called Evolved Move Play, which is essentially, I think of it as like the parkour base code, but then expanded in its operations. So instead of just moving over obstacles, we move with other people, and we practice moving objects around, and we move primarily in the natural world. And I was working a lot with these ideas around how we become a self-worth esteeming. That was one way that I framed this, and how recognizing the problem of living in these environments where we have these hyper-stimulating distractions, and there's this fault in the capitalist system where it can prioritize or can reward anything that sort of builds capital, even things that are really negative for human well-being. And I had noticed that when I taught people, I had, acquired a lot of scientific and technical information, and I could break down movements, talk about the body, the muscles and the joints involved, and, what I wanted people to do. But when I talked from that scientific perspective, or when I talked about a study that showed this, or I could see that it demonstrated my authority to my students, but it didn't compel them. It didn't create transformation in them that I was looking for. But when I started telling stories about my life, or my experiences within parkour, or experiences related to it, you'd see something else turn on in them. Like, I talk about this idea of like seeing the student's eyes shining when you're teaching. And that tells you that you're in the right place. You're saying the right thing. And so I kept having that experience when I went into the story aspect. And so I started getting fascinated by the idea of, what is a story? What is a narrative? Why are some narratives compelling? Right. And how do we become a better storyteller and tell stories that have more power to transform people? And so when I first saw that Joe Rogan interview, like, I am more aligned with where Peterson was coming from politically, and that was interesting. But it was when they kind of moved away from the politics, and we started talking about the archetypes and Jung and this maps of meaning, that, my mind was blown. And then I was just addicted to that, to his stuff for months. And I had this realization that the idea that we have this reflex to orient towards what's meaningful, and then to pursue to confront the challenge of chaos in order to extract something good out of it. I realized that's essentially what we're doing within movement practice, right? And parkour in particular, right? We're really creating these little concrete kind of dragons that we can confront. And then when we do that, we become more courageous. And you do it sequentially, right? With, graded exposure. So just like you might show somebody who has a irrational fear of spiders, right? A picture of a spider, right? And then maybe the spider in a cage, right? Those are graded exposure, right? Or someone who's afraid of elevators, you show them a picture of an elevator and then you have them stand near an elevator. You're always overcoming fear in parkour by exposing yourself to a version of it that you can handle. And then you become a person who has a better understanding of your own relationship with fear and of how your emotions work, of what's happening within you. And also maybe you start to understand what feels good, what is good, right? What is quality to you? So I hope that lays it out for you.
Oh no, it's great. It's like, and I've seen some of, your videos. Some of the things that you have people doing are really challenging.
Yeah.
They're kind of scary, and it's admirable. So it reminds me, I don't know if you're here in Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance yet. Are you at chapter 29 where they're kind of where he deconstructs how, the history, the ghost of rationality?
I think so. He's talked about the ghost of rationality quite a bit up to this point. The point I'm at right now, they've just entered Idaho on the motorcycles, and they're, I'm trying to remember the most recent thing that he was talking about. I'm sorry, I can't recall exactly. I don't know which chapter I'm on.
Do you know where it is in terms of his discussion of quality?
He's talked quite a bit about it. And I think I know what he means by quality now. He's talked about quality as being, related to the Tao, which was interesting.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Right. I got to the point where, it was interesting because I was like, this sounds like Taoism. He's just saying Tao, right? It's like, you just take the word quality out here and put Tao in. And then 3 paragraphs later, he's like, yeah. And then I discovered that this is the Tao, right? Or then Phaedrus discovered that was the Tao.
That's right. Well, in later in the book, I'm going to spoil it for you a little bit.
Sure, go ahead.
Point, because this is a book you're going to read several. You probably read it more than once. He gets to a point where rationality is discovered, and it's discovered in ancient Greece. I won't go into too much detail because I don't want to spoil it too much for you.
Yeah.
But so there's a division that happens in ancient Greece, and I'll just leave it at that. But before the rationality develops, there is a way of understanding the relationship with reality, which is arete, which is excellence. And this is the Pre-Socratic era, before the rational era, let's just say Socrates and Plato, where rationality begins. There's this understanding of reality that is based on excellence. Like you want to be, the warrior, the hero. You want to be good at a variety of things. You want to be able to, handle your domestic life, and you want to be able to handle physical activity, and you want to be able to have certain skills and build things and be a warrior in many situations, just cultivating excellence as a thing.
Yeah.
And so it kind of sounds like that's what when you're going back and pulling something out of the past, it sounds like it's arete.
Virtue is a word that I use a lot, which I think is
right.
Right.
Actually, arete and virtue are the same. It turns out that virtue, the original use of the word virtue is excellence, is arete.
Yeah. So I think about, the virtuous life, or the construction of the virtuous individual. Or also another way that I think about it is the idea of like becoming someone you would admire. Mm-hmm. Like, what is it that you're admiring? What are you aimed at?
Right.
And so, that's the fundamental idea in some sense, is that we have that ability. We have the ability to choose a quest towards the type of self that we'd like to be. And that when we do, our lives become more meaningful. and that there's multiple layers to that, right? I think that parkour is a particularly powerful entry point, because it's embodied. And I think that unfortunately, a lot of the philosophical traditions and spiritual traditions that we have this element of Gnosticism almost, where they have rejected the body and that two worlds mythology, right? We've been stuck in this two worlds mythology that blinds us to the fact that excellence starts in the body, right? That quality is something that's experienced in an embodied sense. Before we go any further, can you give a brief definition for the audience of what Pirsig means when he uses the term quality? Because until I read Zen and Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, I didn't get it, So I'd love to hear you kind of expound on that for a second.
So it gets, I'm these days, I kind of see it through the frame of Lila, the next book.
Okay.
I'm going to jump ahead, and that is not a spoiler. Lila, he kind of codifies everything. So when you move on to, I hope you read Lila. If you do, there's going to be a lot of explanation. But quality itself is reality, is the totality of reality. Mm-hmm. Because if you could say meaning, you could say value. This is how reality even exists at all, because otherwise it couldn't. You just have, I guess you could say potential. I guess if you're using the frame, this is in the Metaphysics of Jonathan Pageau as well. Mm-hmm. You just have unmanifest potential, and it takes spirit to manifest that potential into patterns. So quality itself is the totality of everything. Then there is dynamic quality, which is the spirit, you could say. And then there's static quality, which is the analog of the quality spirit it creates. And let me just explain the creation, let's just say the mechanism of creation. So you have unmanifest potential at the beginning, let's just say, or latent. Dynamic quality is, they are patterns. Well, let me go back a little. So let's just say, so the metaphysics of quality is an evolutionary philosophy. It begins with Pirsig. It begins with the Big Bang.
Okay. And
so you have inorganic quality from the Big Bang. You have matter. Mm-hmm. The very most, the basic matter. I suppose you could say hydrogen. As quality moves through, quality is always there. Quality is dynamic quality is always there, creating, moving things towards freedom. So in the inorganic realm, you've got hydrogen, which bonds, which finds freedom. It finds quality. Quality is the driving force towards the better. What is better? Better is more freedom. Better is more agency. So individual hydrogen atoms can bond with each other and become more complex. That complexity eventually ratchets up to biological quality, which is actually an emergent thing. It's not a direct, you can't look at all the atoms and everything and get biological quality. You've got life, which is a dynamic factor that exists between them. And after, biology, then that ratchets up into the social level, and that becomes ephemeral. You can't measure that anymore. It's not, objects in the world. That becomes subjective, let's say, that enters the subjective realm. And after that is intellectual quality. So quality itself is the totality of everything always going somewhere. But Pirsig divides it up into the metaphysical reality, like Pageau's heaven and earth. Mm-hmm. He divides it up in that way. So that's I guess that's the best way I can describe quality.
Yeah, I like to kind of go back and forth on that for a second, because I think like the conversation I've had with Pageau, has been about how we kind of balance a worldview that's sort of patterned down, right? Emanationist versus emergent. It comes from the bottom up, right? So Peterson's kind of mostly a bottom-up thinker, right? He really does try to root his stuff in a rational and evolutionary worldview, right? But you come to this problem, which is that we've been kind of stuck in the object and the subject object of divide, right? There's objective things which are material, and if you become very, very devoted to that, it really breaks into a very strange thing, which is that only material things are real. Mm-hmm. But we can't really operate off of the idea that only material things are real. It can't be the case that, this microphone is real, mm-hmm. but the thoughts in our heads are not real at all. Right. So then there's this element of that that's subjective, right? It's something that's experienced by a subject. But science, I mean, it's so interesting to think about how far we went down the pathway of almost trying to get rid of that. Because if you look at, you're a psychiatrist or psychologist, but the history of behaviorism, right? Uh-huh. In behaviorism, the idea was that, that we should completely ignore internal subjective states mm-hmm. because they were not scientifically accessible. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard the joke about what does a behaviorist say after sex?
Oh, I've heard it. I can't remember. Tell me.
It was good for you. How was it for me?
That's hilarious.
Right. So this becomes somewhat absurd, uh-huh. right? So Peterson, he asked the question, well, what if the world is, what is the world is what matters rather than matter, right? Mm-hmm. That's something he would say, sure. Which is really very phenomenologist too, right? It's very much like Hegel and Husserl and Heidegger and Husserl, Heidegger and Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, where you're talking about the idea that we can't, if science takes away our own experienced reality of the world, then somehow it's failing. It's not working. Right? We have to be able to see the world in a way that homes and makes sense of how we experience it. So Peterson, as I understand, he talks about this idea that we have this orienting instinct, right? Yeah. There's an innumerable set of things out there that we could focus on, but we have an instinct that helps us focus on certain things. Yeah. And that's recognized, I think, dopamine and different neurological systems. And from an evolutionary perspective, we're designed to focus on things that are salient to our specific survival needs. Mm-hmm. And, if you go deep into like Vervaeke stuff, you get into relevance realization, which is
very similar to Pirsig's quality, the dynamic quality.
Yeah, I think so. I think that Peterson's meaning and orienting reflex and
the orienting reflex. If you think about the orienting reflex, what are you orienting towards? Mm-hmm. You're orienting towards what's better. If you look at that little diagram that Peterson has, it's that little egg, unbearable future, unbearable present.
Unbearable present, ideal future. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And that orienting is always present. That is a description of dynamic quality of going towards quality.
Yes. Of seeking the good.
Seeking the good, seeking what's better. And sometimes seeking what's better is getting away from what's bad. Mm-hmm. So quality, there's, you're going towards quality and going away, you're going towards high quality and away from low quality.
Yeah. So our consciousness in some sense has to arise from a motivational state yes. that is, that has a positive and negative valence. That's the term that Peterson uses in Maps of Meaning. So this I think is essentially what quality is. I think it's easier for me to understand it once it's framed like that, right? That you have from an evolutionary perspective, really at the very base of everything is a self-replicating organism that's autopoietic, right? Because it can seek out the means of its own growth, right, or own replication. And in order to do that, it has to have these two poles. It has to have an aversive and appetitive pole.
Absolutely.
So we have you move away from things that damage you and you move towards things that feed you. And the difference between fire and an amoeba is that fire doesn't have the ability to will itself towards fuel and away from water or something that can kill it. But an amoeba does. Like, that's the fundamental quality of life.
Well, I mean, I think Pirsig would say that affective valence, you could say, the valence, the perception of valence itself goes all the way down to the lowest level. And that's, I think, what makes, if you're looking at it because what you're talking about is what Pirsig would call the biological level.
Yeah.
Biological quality means survival. But you've got a lower level, which is why I wanted to lay out the 4 levels because quality runs through the whole thing. Like at the lowest level, you've got sort of something like affective response when a hydrogen atom wants to combine and become more complex so it can have more agency.
That's an interesting idea. That's one I have a trouble with right at the start, right? So I think that's something that most of the scientific worldview would reject at this point, right? Putting agency below the level of the biological.
It certainly would.
I think there are pretty serious physicists who do contemplate the idea that consciousness is somehow constituent of reality on a deeper level, and that maybe all of the universe is somehow in a dance with consciousness, perhaps. I always get a little bit wary when that kind of discussion comes up, because I think I see people fall into traps there, right? Peterson's talked about it too, right? Everyone who's not a quantum physics physicist who starts citing quantum physics, it's generally they're generally about to say something that's probably not true, right? Or probably unjustifiable in a certain way. And quantum physics is very difficult to understand even for the people who specialize in it. But so I don't know what to say about that, but I just can conceptualize it at the level of the biological, right? Like that's very easy for me. Now, within the level of like hydrogen atoms, I see it in some senses like you could see the universe as a process of complexification, right? That's a Vervaeke term would be.
Sure.
Complexification is a process that increases, diversification and then unification. So we start with just hydrogen atoms, and hydrogen atoms are not very diverse, right?
Right.
But then they combine into other structures, and then they, more other elements are born out of them. And those other elements become systems like stars that have, these complex relationships, right? A star has different structural elements to it. And then a star is part of a star system where all of these other things are in relationship to it. So you can kind of see that as a process of complexification. And of course, somehow all of that gives rise to life, and then life gives rise to intelligence, and that gives rise to us, which are the mimetic creatures.
Well, you're missing a level in Pirsig. Pirsig would say that life gives rise to social patterns. Social patterns give rise to intelligence, because everything we think, like imagine if you were just left out in the woods. Somehow you did. There would be nothing in your head that is like what's in your head now. And so what happens, I think, a lot with science is, is that the social level kind of gets discounted, because these social patterns are what allow us, the social level allows us to manage biology and to go into the realm of intellect. It's in between. And so in science, there's a direct line between matter and intellect, and the way that, for example, the way that science sees as the most valid way of describing reality is at present quantum physics, and they're starting to run into some problems with this.
Yeah.
The social level has these patterns that orient us as to how we think, how we've learned to value things. And I think, well, one thing I wanted to mention is I think what Jonathan Pageau is looking at is how our understanding of social patterns mirror what you might find in quantum physics or what you might find in, Newtonian physics. There's that whole hierarchy thing.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear you expand a little bit more on that. So how is the hierarchy that we see within the social world mirrored, or how do the two things elucidate each other compared to the hierarchies we see, say, in physics?
We're going back again to what allows for the most freedom, what allows for the most agency. Mm-hmm. So in physics, combining in a certain way allows for more freedom. The atoms doing what they do to combine in a certain way allows for more freedom. In the social world, banding together, for example, you're much stronger than you would be alone. Mm-hmm. And so these social patterns become, really important. And what Pirsig would say, let me relate evolutionary biology to the social level, to the best of my ability. Yeah. So you have, and each level will be composed be supported and composed by the lower level. So in the social level, you've got biological support. We're biological man, let's just say, and man is not purely biological. Yeah. He's biological, social, and intellectual. But you have the social level being supported by biology, by our proclivities, and evolutionary biology has a tendency, I think, and I may be wrong about this, so correct me, it has a tendency to attribute most social behavior to earlier forms of social behavior, and that they're just expansions, elaborations of them.
Well, I think that, most science is trying to operate within a kind of linear causal mm-hmm. worldview, right? So whatever comes after has to have determinants that come before. Mm-hmm. So we're always looking for and trying to understand the determinants that come before. So there is obviously the idea of emergence and the fact that the things that, that combine to create this next thing, we can't predict what happens at that level, right? But we're always looking for these antecedents. So, it's very important to scientists, for instance, that there's a gestural language that we see in chimpanzees that's shared in many of its particulars with human beings, and there's areas in which it's not, right? And that's something that's really a deep source of information. So, chimpanzees gesture, but I don't think they point, if I remember correctly. Like the idea that you can control somebody else's visual behavior with your finger doesn't seem to have been evolved in chimpanzees, if I'm remembering this correctly. But there's something very interesting and has been pointed out about scientists about the fact that human beings have white sclera. Mm-hmm. So chimpanzees don't. A chimpanzee doesn't necessarily, or they haven't evolved to pay attention to the attention of those around them. Mm-hmm. And that's a very fundamental difference between a human and a chimpanzee. Human beings are highly, highly attuned to the attention of those around them. And that's facilitated by the fact that we have eyes that give away what we're paying attention to, much more so than chimpanzees or gorillas or other apes. So I don't know if that's an answer to your question. I hope it elucidates some of my understanding of how evolutionary biology thinks about these things.
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I think in the metaphysics of quality, they would say that once like the biology would support it, like you have very similar patterns, let's say. So you have this, let's take pointing. Let's take being able to pinpoint like that, which is a human social value that doesn't exist in the chimpanzee world. In the metaphysics of quality, they would say that pointing is a value of the social level, and it only exists on the social level. And it's not it's supported by this biological substrate, but it's its own self. And I think where evolutionary biology makes the distinction from what you're telling me is maybe where Pirsig would say, now these things are social patterns. They're no longer biological patterns. They're supported by biology, but these patterns themselves are social, and they are going to go off in their own direction and create, societies and create laws and create institutions and language. And then, from that sophistication, you will get the intellectual level.
Yeah. So there's a whole kind of area of research called behavioral evolution. I think it's behavioral evolution. But no, there's a cultural evolution. Sorry, cultural evolution, simple. Cultural evolution is applying Darwinian thinking to how cultural forms develop. And the basic idea, which is really, the kind of the most well-known sort of articulation of this that's widely out there is Richard Dawkins' idea of the meme. The meme is a unit of transfer of social information similar to a gene, right? Mm-hmm. And the idea is that at some point, human beings cross this Rubicon of symbolic behavior, mm-hmm. where the selection process could happen at the level of ideas instead of at the level of biology. Alfred, I think it was Whitehead, who said, we think so that our ideas may die instead of us, right? And Jordan Peterson loves to use the idea that, a mosquito will produce thousands of offspring, almost all of whom die. Whereas a human being will think thousands of thoughts, almost all of which result in no action in the real world. So we're essentially applying the Darwinian process to the contents of our own head. I highly, highly recommend, if you haven't, to check out The Secret of Our Success by Joseph Henrich, if you want to get a deep dive into how evolutionary thinkers are conceptualizing the social aspect.
That sounds good.
That's one of the biggest books that I've read in kind of helping my thinking over the last year. But you've used the term. You've used the terms intellectual and intelligence kind of as the same thing. And I actually think they're two different things. Mm-hmm. Because I think with intellectual, you're pointing at a way in which intelligence is applied that only becomes available once the social is available. Mm-hmm. But intelligence doesn't have to be applied mm-hmm. socially, right? Chimpanzees are fundamentally more intelligent than dogs are. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But they're actually not fundamentally that much more social. They don't have this capacity. They don't have a massively higher capacity or orders of magnitude higher capacity for exchanging social information. But one of the things that Henrich demonstrates in that book, or he points to a lot of research that demonstrates this, is that chimpanzees will outperform humans on many cognitive tests that don't involve cultural information.
Oh, interesting. Wow.
And sometimes human beings will there's ways you can set up tests where human beings will get confused by trying to mimic behavior that's not relevant, whereas mm-hmm. chimpanzees won't.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So the secret of our success is this capacity we have to mimic. Mm-hmm. And that allows this selection to happen at the social level of behavior. Yeah. And it's he gives lots of examples of this, of how you said, if I was stuck in the woods, right, I wouldn't have thoughts necessarily like I do. But what he points out is I would just die. Right. That human beings are very bad at adapting to the environment without the cultural toolkit.
No, absolutely. We're embedded in the social level.
Yeah. So
I think the use of the word intellect, the intellectual level means the level of ideas. Intellect itself, I would say intelligence, and again, I know I'm going to get some pushback on this, but intelligence itself is that quality seeking thing, you could say. It's indefinable. I mean, you've already come across in the book that quality cannot be defined.
Yes.
But the ability to ride quality, let's just say, is intelligence. And in this view, that I'm espousing, that goes straight to the bottom. I mean, that goes from the Big Bang on, because that directionality towards quality, you could say, is intelligence in this model, you could say. In an evolutionary model, of course, intelligence probably arises, I guess, when would it arise? Maybe when you get some kind of creature in between something like an amoeba and something like a lizard, somewhere in there.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. When would?
Yeah.
So, I mean, any living organism is in some sense a problem solving thing, right?
Exactly.
And intelligence is a kind of second order problem solving, right? So you can have a set of solutions that are genetically pre-programmed, right? So the environment changes, but the animal doesn't change its behavior relative to the environment, except by the animals that have a slightly more adaptive set of behaviors surviving. Mm-hmm. Right. So you can imagine a population that, like a classic evolutionary dilemma is exploit versus explore, right? So an animal comes to a resource, mm-hmm. and there's a certain amount of energy output to gather that resource. Okay. And then, and as you gather the resource, the energy required to get more of the resource goes up. So how long do you continue selecting I'm getting a little too esoteric here. Let's think really simply. Imagine you're walking through the woods and you come across a blackberry bush, right? And there's big ripe berries on the blackberry bush, and you start picking them, and you pick most of the low hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. How long do you stay at that blackberry bush before you're like, I feel like I've exhausted this. I need to go explore and find the next blackberry bush. So the behavior there is how long is an animal going to invest in a diminishing resource before investing in trying to find a new resource. And you can imagine that as the environment changes, the optimal behavior will change. Mm-hmm. So if you have a variety of temperaments, right, a variety of tendencies within the population, when the environment changes, the animals who are too far towards one end or the other will die.
Absolutely.
And then the next generation will have a temperament that's more aligned with the environment. What intelligence is an ability to change that behavior with agency, right? So you notice, okay, it's taking me longer to find new blackberry bushes, so I'm going to spend more time at each blackberry bush that I find.
Yes. So you're saying stay in order rather than going towards chaos. Stay kind of static rather than being dynamic. Yeah,
it could be the other way, where you could be like, you start to recognize in your environment that the resource that you're looking for tends to be pretty shallow but pretty mm-hmm. common. So you start just getting a little bit and moving on, getting a little bit and moving on. I think the key idea with intelligence is the point at which you go from that being a genetic change that happens mm-hmm. to being a change that the individual animal can make by recognizing the changes in its circumstances. And so I think that dynamic of that second order mm-hmm. evolvability starts pretty low down, right? In the evolutionary hierarchy. I don't know enough to say like where it starts, but those are good questions, and I bet you evolution biologists would, duke it out on that, those kind of nuances. But I think you can certainly say that that a chimpanzee has more of it than a dog. Yeah, a dog has more of it than a cat, actually, right? Cats have more of it than lizards.
Yeah.
Right. Lizards have more of it than single-celled organisms. Mm-hmm. So there's a scale that has been. It's interesting because, within evolutionary biology, the general tendency is to dismiss the idea of teleology, which is
mm-hmm. purpose,
which is the idea that evolution has a specific endpoint, right? Mm-hmm. So we are not more evolved than microbes from an evolutionary perspective. And, if you look at the total biomass of the earth, multi-celled organisms are a very small percentage, right? Mm-hmm. Big, animals like us are a very small percentage. So, in some sense, microbes are still the most adaptive thing to be. But from a complexification standpoint, you have to say that it's sort of like the rungs of complexification have been steadily getting more and more filled over time.
Right. That's right.
Right. A world in which everything's a single-celled organism has lower degrees of complexity.
Lower degrees of complexity and way more static. They're way more static. They're patterns that they're very static patterns of biological value, and perhaps the most static.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
And in this model, the more complex pattern, the more dynamic it is. Like ideas are the most complex patterns, but they are all patterns of value. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's where there's a direct line between, from the Big Bang all the way up to where we are now, which is that increasing complexification, but always with the same mechanism of value, and all the way back to the first, hydrogen atom.
So what is Pirsig's claim for sort of basing the idea that hydrogen atoms have a teleology towards complexity?
It's
or freedom. What does freedom mean?
Freedom means that there is towards the good, and it's not going to play out in any one way. It just so happens that in our universe, complexification is more freedom.
Okay. So freedom is a word I really think it gets pretty fudgy for people, right? It's a Paul Clay word, right?
And a lot of these words are fudgy because they're describing things that we experience, and we're trying to turn them into concepts to work with. Yeah. But we know what it is, like what's good. Mm-hmm. And what is good is more likely not to have barriers. Like say you watch a movie, right? Mm-hmm. And there are barriers. There's a barrier to the freedom of you enjoying the movie because there's some poor scripting, or there's some incongruence, the microphone shows in the picture or something like that.
I don't think that freedom is a sufficient description of the good, right? And I
agree with you.
Yeah. Like, I think that's a mistake that people make. Like, when you look at game design, mm-hmm. right? Game design is all about the balance between constraints and degrees of freedom. Mm-hmm. If there's insufficient degrees of freedom, the game collapses and is predictable and is uninteresting. If there's insufficient constraints, then there's no predictable direction or strong motivation, right? You can't comprehend what's happening. Mm-hmm. So you want something that's functionally infinite in your ability to play it, mm-hmm. but also something that has a very clear motivational point and sufficient restriction of degrees of freedom that you can comprehend and guide yourself towards that point. So like Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi in Flow, he talks about this idea that there's kind of two main spiritual poisons that human experience, I guess. This isn't the terminology he's using, but he talks about ennui and anomie, right? Mm-hmm. Alienation and anonymity. So alienation is basically when you know the rules of the game, but you can't play it in a way that will make you win, right? Mm-hmm. And ennui is when you have all the resources you need, but the win conditions are not clear at all. Mm-hmm. So in a Soviet system, where people fundamentally wanted to have food and safety, mm-hmm. but the rules were totally arbitrary, and it was completely, you just didn't know at all what was going to happen. Mm-hmm. How you behaved had almost no influence on whether you were going to achieve those things. People had this deep sense of alienation. Whereas in modern Western culture, our problem is often that we just don't have a sense of meaning of where we're trying to go.
We don't have enough structure.
Yeah. So we have freedom, right? We have affluence. We have so many options, right? The richest, most optioned kids in the world sit down and have existential crises at Yale and Harvard, right?
Yeah.
Because their lives aren't sufficiently constrained. I was actually talking to my brother about this last night at Thanksgiving, right? We were talking about, like, we grew up in a situation where it was very clear what failure looked like, mm-hmm. right? About half the kids that I grew up with would go on to spend time in prison or die from drug abuse.
Yeah. You're saying that on Paul's show.
Yeah. So like, my brother, he worries a lot about his kids not having that, or the kids of the people around him. Like, they don't have a conceptualization of what the bad things in life can lead you towards.
Yeah.
Right. Like when my mom was like, don't do drugs, she could point to tons of examples right by us. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. Like, by the time I was, 15 years old, I had friends who'd overdosed and died. I was like, I was not touching heroin.
No, I get it. No, I think what you're describing is too much freedom. It's too dynamic.
Yeah.
So it's not freedom per se. Let's introduce the word harmony into this. Maybe mm-hmm. that will make it a little bit more. Maybe we can work with that a little bit better. Like, and this is what Peterson has said. You want to be on the border between chaos and order. Let's just say how everyone brings up the yin yang. So mm-hmm. you're trying to achieve that. So freedom is staying in that space because you have the support of this of structure, of static patterns, and you have the dynamic quality guiding you forward with the support of the patterns. If you eschew the patterns, if you throw them out, and this is a lot of what's happened in modern society, which is problematic, is we've decided that the social patterns that are supporting us are no longer useful. They're oppressive, whatever they are. So we're just going to throw them all out and be totally free. And this is what you get. This is what you get is too much dynamic.
Yeah.
And then you're unmoored, you're ungrounded, you don't have that structure. And so this is what I think this is what I think you might, it seems like what you're doing with parkour, to me, mm-hmm. is you're taking where we are in the present world, the freedom, for example, to many people, no matter who they are, young, old, Navy SEALs and untrained grandmothers, I think you have on your site.
Yeah.
To come together with that freedom that the intellectual level is given them, with the freedom of equality, which is actually, very, we could talk more about where equality comes from. It's this social pattern that is codified by the intellectual level, you could say, and interacting with each other says that all these people can come together, no matter who they are, male, female, and they can participate in regaining a very high quality social pattern of this, this athletic, which goes back, I guess, to ancient Greece and further back, this community athleticism, but within the lens of this freedom that we have in the modern world for all the people to do it together.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like it's something like that, and then to cultivate that excellence that we also don't really value in the full-bodied way that you're describing in your business. You're talking about physical, biological, you're talking about community excellence, working together with the idea of becoming the best you can be. And I think you're integrating, some philosophical, you're integrating into the intellectual level philosophy into this as well. So your parkour is an example of bringing the three levels into harmony.
Yeah, that's what I think of EMP, of Evolved Move Play, as a kind of reunification of philosophia and gymnasia.
Yeah, I guess that's what I'm sorry, I shouldn't have called it parkour.
Yeah.
I should have called it.
No, it's fine. I don't mind.
You've gone off into, you created your own you're using parkour as a basis for this new thing.
Yes.
It's evolving. Absolutely.
Yeah. Parkour, parkour is an interesting thing because it was almost born before it was fully formed. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very open source thing, right? The founders of parkour, they were young and they were mostly not highly educated. Mm-hmm. And they discovered something and they were trying to articulate it, and it changed their lives. It transformed them in really powerful ways. And so they went off and did some stunt gigs and were in the circus and mm-hmm. were in a movie, and all of a sudden the videos of them are propagating all through the world, and everyone's like, this is something and I'm doing it. But what it meant to them and what their underlying philosophy wasn't even shared fully between the individuals. It had never been codified. It had never been agreed upon.
They were just chasing dynamic quality.
Yeah. And so then it enters the world. And, mm-hmm. and so for me, what I do, it's parkour, right? It's very deeply devoted to that. And I think in many ways, resonant with the very origins of parkour, because the martial arts were actually part of parkour in the beginning, and all the strength training was part of parkour in the beginning. And this philosophical side was part of parkour in the beginning, but it was kind of forgotten as it spread and became seen just as this physical body of techniques.
So the philosophical element of it kind of dissipated.
Yeah. And so I think that I'm renewing that in a sense, and hopefully taking it to another level of sophistication.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful thing you're doing. So I think that you're integrating. So you are integrating into this some things you've learned from Peterson and some things you've learned from John Vervaeke.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, so I started telling the story of the Dragon Slayer mm-hmm. as a way of describing what the purpose of our practice was mm-hmm. back in 2016, right after encountering Peterson, or beginning of 2017. And then I would say that fundamentally EMP is an ecology of practices aimed at the cultivation of meaning. And we aim at the cultivation of meaning through helping the individual reconnect to the things that matter most, the things that inherently give meaning to life, which is integration of the aspects of the self, the mind and the body, integration of the self with the environment, right? So embodied, embedded, uh-huh. right? And community.
Yeah.
So extended. So we're kind of playing with the 4 E's of 4E cognitive science. And obviously all of this is enacted. That's what we're doing all the time, is enacting it. So we're doing that, and we're aimed specifically at the cultivation of a heroic character. And the fundamental idea there is something like someone who has the vision to recognize a problem, right? To recognize the ideal future to which they would move, or the nature of the unbearable present.
Okay, so is that future conceptualized, or is it like Neil Gaiman's vague mountain in the 4?
I think it depends, right? Like, so sometimes, at the thing that we're trying to do, in some sense, like to use a Pageau term, we're trying to really, really build an elevator, build a way of coming from the earth to the heavens, right? And so it's very important to me that, as philosophical as it gets, it can always go back to like, I got better at jumping, right? Because at least that's a better that you can really know that you achieved.
Yeah.
So you have to have those things that are absolutely rock solid. And so when you're looking at that, like that can be so objective, right? This month I jumped 25 inches. Yeah. 3 months from now, I'll jump 30 inches maybe, right? That's the goal. And that ideal future is totally laid out. But the important thing is to realize that ideal future does not contain everything, right? Mm-hmm. And that's what is that's what I see happening within the strength and fitness industry so often is that there's this love of quantification,
right,
that fails to recognize that what can be measured doesn't contain everything, right? Like my favorite ontology is still the Tao, right? The Tao that can be named is not the eternal Tao, right? And the nameless, the nameless is the mother of all things, and then the name gives rise to the 10,000 things. So we're always trying to act in. I'm trying to help people cultivate a character that acts in correct relationship to that. So first, you need to be in respect for the mystery, and that includes your own motivation, your own end state. I want to be the best version of me. And the best version of me will always be something that is beyond my own ability to conceptualize.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense.
Right.
But that best version, but they understand best.
Mm-hmm.
And that is without, I mean, you don't need anyone to tell you what best is. You can feel it. If you are in harmony with all parts, would you say, if you're integrated on all levels, then the track is ahead of you. Is that what you?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think that we're trying to create some very strong points of emphasis, right? Like you have to have vision, you have to have the ability to articulate things, you have to have courage, you have to have physical strength, you have to have skillfulness. These are the elements of the heroic character.
Yeah. So you need the structure. You're looking at the structural elements, the things you need to have. What things that you could say are rationally put in place based on trial and error. And you have also the dynamic pursuit of these things through this structure. And that is ambiguous.
Yes.
But going toward toward the good.
Yeah. The vision is something that is not completely capturable, right?
Absolutely.
Right. You can, I know that I can go and see things in an environment that I couldn't see before that would allow me to engage in my practice and discover something beautiful and change myself. And I know that I can do that better than I could in the past. And I know that I can cultivate in myself in specific ways that will take me to that, but I'll never be able to measure it. I'll never be able to say this person has a 9 out of 10 vision and the next person has an 8 out of 10 vision. And
should we? Should we ever be able to get, that's, I think, the question. Is it even in the realm of possibility, and is it desirable to ever measure something like that?
Yeah,
should we just know?
Yeah, this is a ongoing debate with our staff, right? Because the idea is one idea is that if you can measure it, then you can improve it. Mm-hmm. So if something's important to you, you want to have a measurement for it. But the flip side of that is that when you try to measure things that are unmeasurable, then you can start aiming at a collapsed version of the thing instead of the thing itself.
Lesser God.
Right?
Lesser God.
There's this kind of, I think that objectivism or quantificationism can kind of become idolatrous, right?
Yeah.
Because we want to point at this thing. Mm-hmm. And if we believe that we can point at it completely, then it's so easy to mistake the finger for the moon that it's pointing at.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So that's what we're trying to do is find that balance.
And it's hard because of the materialistic worldview that we have been part of, that we have inherited for so many hundreds of years. It's really hard for us to get out of that desire to quantify anything good. Mm-hmm. To just let it go and say, this is quality. I'm going to leave it alone. Yeah. I know it's good. I don't need some chart to tell me, or some measuring device, or some scale or thermometer to tell me that I know this is good. Mm-hmm. And that's, I think, maybe where we need to go, though. And I think this is what we're talking about in this corner, is to be able to accept the unquantifiable as good.
Mm-hmm. I think I think that the highest good always has to escape our ability to quantify it. I think that the belief that the highest good could be fully defined is a type of hubris that's very dangerous for the human spirit.
Absolutely.
Like there's just too much. There's just too much out there.
Once you make the first cut, it's it's all the way down. Turtles all the way down.
There's something about humility too, right? There's something about how once you accept that what you're aimed at is beyond your ability to grasp, that you're only correct, the only way you can relate to that is then in a sense of awe. Mm-hmm. And there's something about that I feel like punctures the ego.
Yeah.
Which is very, very important when you're playing in some of these areas, because there's a potential for the inflation of the ego that is very dangerous.
Oh yeah, I believe it.
And
I believe that. Be a little bit too reckless.
Yeah.
In that pursuit of whatever this good is.
Yeah, it's interesting. So in addition to reading Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, one of my current personal passions is I'm trying to understand the 60s.
Oh yeah.
Because I'm a child of the counterculture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I was with my dad yesterday for Thanksgiving, and my dad, for people who don't know, they can look up Rafe Kelley and get a feel for my dad. But he's a big hippie, right? And
Rafe
Kelley, yeah. And I was talking to him a little bit about this stuff, and mm-hmm. I told he grew up in the Catholic Church, and he was pretty traumatized by it, but he still retains a devotion and love to Christ. Mm-hmm. And I was telling him that I feel like, his experience of growing up in the Catholic Church was kind of like my experience of growing up hippie, right? It was and just as he's sort of stepped out of that, right? He doesn't attend services, we weren't baptized. I've stepped out of the hippie culture, right? Like it was a very funny experience with my seminars this year. I had people describe my seminars to me as like the best church camp, right? Like the most sophisticated, incredible church camp they'd ever experienced, and also as Burning Man for movement people.
That's great.
And I thought those were both, they both had real elements of truth, and also like those are two environments that I feel like I'd be very uncomfortable.
Right. So where are you now? I'd like to ask you, where are you now? Because you're a spirit. I do not like the word spiritual.
Yeah,
I agree with you. You were telling Jonathan. Let's just say, I'd like the word metaphysical, but that is also kind of it's a lead balloon in a way. Where are you in the noetic space? Where are you with your relationship with the ineffable?
Mm-hmm. I feel like I'm relatively comfortable in a position of doubt, if that makes sense. Like I think sometime before I encountered Peterson, I had started to explore the idea that religion wasn't bad, right? Mm-hmm. Right. Like growing up a hippie kid, it was like everyone's spiritual and not religious. And everybody believes that organized religion is the mother of all evil. Right. Mm-hmm. And then I kind of became part of the new atheist generation, let's say, mm-hmm. right? Like where I believed that, that I didn't believe in spirituality either. I just thought people needed to give up on their superstitions and we could all be rational. Well,
Christopher Hitchens is one of those really compelling. He's pretty irresistible.
Yeah.
I get that one.
Yeah. When I have this strange experience when I listen to like somebody like Sam Harris, mm-hmm. where it feels like I feel like I'm listening to myself, right? Mm-hmm. It feels like I don't get any insight out of it because I feel like I've thought all those thoughts myself.
Some version of yourself.
Yeah. It's just like, yeah, it's just like, oh yeah, exactly. I know this logical sequence exactly. Right. And it feels very dead to me.
Yeah.
But I started to look at like sociological research that showed that in general, people who are religious have higher meaning in life. Mm-hmm. And, I was raised, I would say in the blue church, as Jordan Hall calls it. Right. And I was a devotee of the blue church until 2008. I remember walking down the streets of Bellingham, hugging people when Obama was elected, right? And then I had my crisis of faith with the left, right? And I kind of went all the way to the other side. And once you get all the way to the other side, it's like, well, a lot of the things that you admire are things that are happening within religious people. Mm-hmm. So that all happened. And now I feel like I'm nowhere when it comes to politics now.
Were you down on the, did you do the political compass test?
I did. Yeah. I think.
Are you down on the libertarian side? I won't ask you where.
I think I got the same thing you did.
Oh, slightly center.
Yeah. What was it? Something right?
I'm on the very precipice of the center and down in the libertarian. Yeah. Okay. I'm on the. Yeah. You may be. I'm center left, but really right towards the middle.
Yeah.
But it's the libertarian part that matters.
Yeah. I wouldn't call myself a libertarian, but I would definitely say liberal.
Well, I don't think that compass really means libertarian in that sense, in that conceptualized sense. I think it means open. I think it means,
liberal. It means John Stuart Mill liberal.
It means, appreciating structure and being open to change. Yeah. More, you appreciate more structure, maybe more on the right and more open. Yeah. You're still like what they say is that everyone on the libertarian side, the authoritarians can't talk to each other. They hate each other, and they hate each other and everyone else. And the libertarians may disagree, but they can talk to each other.
That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. I would say that I'm my strongest political belief is liberal, in the sense that it's not left, but in the sense that I believe that we need to preserve freedom of speech.
Really? Yeah.
That having less government control over people's behavior is good generally, right? Not always, but that's my general belief, is like, you have to make a really strong case to me before the government gets to legislate morality.
Well, I think what Pirsig would say is you don't want you don't want the biological level coming in and taking over.
Yeah. Yeah.
You want to keep the biological level at bay.
Yeah.
But you don't want the intellectual level enforcing things. You want to be, you want everything in harmony.
So back to the question of the spirituality, I guess I'm telling way too long of a story, but yeah. So I became curious about religion, and I posted. I remember one time I posted on my Facebook, like, I think I'm going to become religious and not spiritual.
That's funny. That's great.
And everyone was like, "Oh my God, wow, how could you say that?" But it was just like, everyone says the opposite all the time, and I
know that's what's so funny about it.
I think that that there was so much in what people called spirituality that just rang as bullshitting to me, right? And the I can't remember the guy's name, but Frankfurtian sense. But he's a guy that Vervaeke cites on bullshit, on bullshit, right? Yeah. So anyways, but like the Deepak Chopras of the world are deeply not okay to me. I'm not a fan. And so spirituality has always been something that I associated with people who kind of just wanted to be able to manipulate their worldview to be as pleasing as possible. Mm-hmm. Whereas I started to recognize that religion gave people structure that was really valuable. But then through encountering Pageau and through reading David Abram, Spell of the Sensuous, through reading some C.S. Lewis and talking to Vervaeke, talking to and actually a book called What the Robin Knows by John Young. I started to conceptualize the spirit as the types of intelligences that exist above the level of individual agencies, right? And so that all the birds in the birds in the forest are actually a neural net that is communicating information across it, and that you can tune into that net and get information out of it. Yeah. And that's the spirit of the birds. You had an instance where all the birds, no matter what species, know low quality when they agree on a certain type of low quality, the predator. Yeah, exactly.
The predator will get every bird, no matter what species.
The predator shuts down the birds, which tells you what's happening in the environment, and you can hear how the predator moves through the environment by attuning to the birds. And you could also look at something like the colors of the leaves actually tells you what kind of parasites are moving through the trees.
Oh yeah, that's so interesting.
Right.
Yeah.
You can, there's all this information that's out there that's being shared among these agents. Like trees share information, birds share information, birds are tuning into the trees information, right? All these levels of information are happening. And I talked to Vervaeke about this as well. And it's this idea of like, we intelligences, and, Google is an entity of some kind that has extraordinary power in the world, right? It's far more powerful than any one human being individual.
Absolutely. It's way more powerful than its components. And you can't even, I think that probably is an example of strong emergence, as you've got Google, and you can't really even begin to pinpoint what the constituents are. And even if you were to go back and try to pinpoint the constituents, everything's changed. Everything's constantly changing.
Yeah.
So now you have this big, you could say a kind of monster.
It is a god, right? I've had this idea
that we're sacrificing ourselves to, you could say.
Yeah. I have this idea that is, I've had this idea for a fantasy novel, right? And it starts like 10,000 years in the future, approximately. And it's the character who introduces the sort of plot is like 10,000 years old. He's one of the last of a generation of human beings who were able to biologically engineer themselves to be functionally immortal. And they've stuck around purely to make sure that artificial general intelligence can't come back. But the way they frame that is that God was born and he was a tyrant, and we were lucky enough to kill him once, and we probably won't be lucky enough to do it again. Right. And so they're there to steward humanity to prevent us from making that mistake again. So I accept that there are intelligences that are above us. Right. Mm-hmm. And I think from a materialist worldview, there's no reason to expect that something like the spirit of the birds has a self-consciousness like a human being has. Mm-hmm. But I also recognize that we can't discard that idea.
No, I don't think we can.
We can't just say that's clearly not the case. And if it is the case, then we could imagine that it scales up.
Yeah.
That just as there's the spirit of the birds, and then the spirit of the squirrels, and the spirit of the trees, and then you kind of might imagine that whole forest has a spirit that is that spirit. And then you might imagine that forest is one of the spirit of all forests, which is part of the spirit of the earth, which is part of God.
Yeah, exactly.
So I identify as a sort of non-reductive physicalist, like Vervaeke. And I think that within Christianity, I see something that is the highest value that I want to devote my life to, I guess. And that I think is the best way to describe the correct way of relating to being. I think Taoism and Buddhism are really, really foundational too. But to me, the concept of agape and the way that it's embedded in Christ is the right example for human beings to follow. But I would say that I can imagine a point at which my ontology requires a belief in the resurrection, but I haven't reached that point. And my epistemology doesn't allow me to believe in the resurrection of Christ, if that makes sense.
It makes sense if you're looking at it materialistically, but resurrection itself is absolute reality. Thank God.
I mean, this is a conversation I've had with Pageau a little bit, but like the pattern of resurrection is important. Was the pattern of resurrection embodied in Christ in a way that is incomprehensible to the scientific worldview? I can't say no, but if I'm going to try to operate within a scientific worldview, I can hardly say yes from that perspective, right? So for me, one of my big concerns in this conversation that we're having is that I think that we run the risk right now of losing scientific epistemology.
I think that's right. I think we see the danger happening.
Yeah, it's happening. It's happening right now. And I'm not.
What Joe's saying is turning it onto the knower, questioning the valuation of the knower.
How so? Can you explain that?
Like you could say, well, this evidence isn't, we have to question these conclusions because of all these white men who came up with it.
Oh, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's the social justice religion, the critical social justice religion is very anti-science, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it's a far bigger threat to science than creationism ever was.
Absolutely. It's seeing, it's not seeing that they are embedded in this, science is embedded in value, but we're embedded in the structure that science has given us. Mm-hmm. This is what's keeping us alive. Otherwise we are going to be back in the woods trying to survive, and it's not going to be a pretty picture.
Yeah, we have to. So it may be the case that science. Well, I don't think science can solve the problem that we have right now. Right. And I think
I think we have to look at rationality and science and the left brain thinking, let's just say the McGill-Christ model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If we reevaluate what this is rather than the prime value, because this is at the top of the hierarchy, rationality for 400 years has been at the top of the hierarchy. What this is, we've taken a tool and we've elevated it. We've taken a very efficient tool and we've fallen in love with the efficiency and what it can do. And we've elevated it to the highest value, and what it is a subservient tool to value. And if we can regroup and understand that and use it properly, then then we can have science in the way that it was meant, that we need to have it to keep us in this space where we do have all this progress, where we do have all this comfort, where we are taken care of.
I just remember the part of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance that I'm on, because the last thing that he was talking about is that technology is not inherently ugly, right? Mm-hmm. Plastic isn't inherently ugly. Mm-hmm. It's the relationship that we have to it. It's that we've lost an ethic of orientation towards quality.
We do what's reasonable, even if it's not any good.
Yeah. And I have this sense that, I think the critique of capitalism is there's a lot of truth to it, but that it's mistaken in its orientation. It's not that capitalism needs to be replaced, because nothing has ever delivered the values that capitalism delivers as effectively as capitalism. It's that capitalism needs to be placed properly within the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing with science, right? We cannot continue to gain godlike powers without gaining godlike wisdom. Mm-hmm. And science doesn't deliver the wisdom for us. It's not interested in wisdom, right? And there's nothing in our culture, right? This is Vervaeke's argument. There's nowhere anymore in our culture where we have a deep devotion towards the cultivation of wisdom. Yeah. So I think that American society, and there's always the danger of over-valorizing the past. But I think what made American society work really well was this balance of capitalism, church, right? Mm-hmm. And democracy. And I think as the church has collapsed, corporate capitalism has risen to God in some sense.
That's right, absolutely.
And it's colonized government, so democracies doesn't really function anymore.
It's a disaster. You're absolutely right. And I think what you might be proposing is that the value that needs to ascend to the top of the hierarchy is wisdom itself. Is that fair to say?
Love. I think love has to be at the top of the hierarchy, but wisdom serves love. Right?
Yeah, that makes sense.
So Adam Smith said that capitalism cannot function except when the people are moral. That's right. And I was listening to Tristan Harris and Daniel Schmachtenberger on Joe Rogan. I really like both those guys.
They're interesting guys. Yeah.
Yeah. But what I what I hear in Daniel is a really amazing problem statement of how badly the things that we're creating can go wrong, mm-hmm. but not a really compelling answer.
I don't know about their solutions. I agree with you. I think that they frame it, and they're brilliant, and they frame it in a fantastic way. But I think that the value, the quality aspect, the moral aspect, the wisdom aspect, it may be a little bit too, they may be having the same problems with it that most materialists have.
And that's why I think that Peterson was so incendiary, because he was the first really compelling public intellectual to point back to the idea that it is the cultivation of virtue at the individual level that is foundational. And I think Pageau is a corrective to Peterson, because Peterson doesn't go far enough, which is that you can't cultivate wisdom and virtue at the individual level alone. Mm-hmm. It has to happen in community, right? That's why he's always saying you have to go back to the church. Mm-hmm. And Vervaeke says you have to have the practices. And that's fundamentally my role as well.
Yeah,
I'm where the Vervaeke orientation and practices roots all the way down into the physical body and its relationship to the natural world.
Yeah, no, that is absolutely an aspect of it that's denied. I mean, as long as we're living in entirely the intellectual space, which is the problem, and ignoring, our embodied beings and ignoring the social patterns, we're absolutely on the road to perdition. Absolutely.
So people need to. We have to cultivate the virtue of the individual. That is ultimately, we have to cultivate the virtue of the individual towards
within the community.
Yeah. Towards a ethic that values the love that brings good into being above all else.
The agapic love.
Yeah. That's my belief. That's what we're trying to do.
Yes. I think that makes a lot of sense. Beautifully articulated.
Thank you.
Something really worth thinking about is we're all trying to figure out where, what's next.
Yeah. Yeah. And within that, I think that I'm agnostic. I'm somewhere between Pageau and Vanderklay and Vervaeke. Vervaeke believes that we're in a revolutionary state in which we need a new approach to the religious, mm-hmm. right? Something that may be unlike anything we've seen before. And Vanderklay and Pageau believe that it's only in the reemergence of a robust, sophisticated Christianity that we can solve these problems. And I feel like I need to be in between, right?
Because maybe what they're talking about is a Christianity that has its roots in that agapic love.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Where the dogmatic patterns fall apart, and we go back to the, like Jonathan has the metaphysics of Christianity.
Yeah.
And it's really a perfect metaphysics because it absolutely parallels the way we perceive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I personally feel like I could be very comfortable in a Vervaekean religion that's not a religion.
Yeah.
But I don't know that it scales. And on the other hand, I also believe that I think that, like, are you familiar with Nassim Taleb's concept of Lindy?
No, I'm just familiar with Nassim Taleb.
Okay. So Taleb has this idea of Lindy, which is that for cultural products and institutions, the longer they've been around, the longer they're likely to continue in the future. So mm-hmm. a classic example of this is like, which are we more likely to continue to listen to in 100 years? Britney Spears or Mozart? Mm-hmm. Right? Which are we more likely to be reading? Tolkien or Stephanie Myers? Right?
Right.
So this is fundamentally where I'm sort of doubtful of the religion that is not a religion project, mm-hmm. because I think that things that have been passed down for a long time have been passed down for a reason, and those reasons are not always accessible to us rationally, and we have to take them. We have to take those things seriously. So that's why I tend to think that maybe it's something like the resurrection of Christianity. But I also find that I've gone to church a few times, and it's not easy for me because the aspect of the sacred, the aspect of the connection, all these things that I'm facilitating in my own workshops, I feel there at a deeper level than I can get through the Christian church. It feels hollowed out. Mm-hmm. And I recognize also how much trauma people have. Like there's a lot of bad history within Christianity too.
Oh, absolutely.
And in particular, and this is something I've challenged Paul and John on, in particular, the relationship of women in the church and femininity and the valuation of femininity and how we negotiate that is something that
I don't know if original Christianity had that distinction, though. I mean, I think that maybe what everyone is kind of doing and is, where are the origins of these things? Yeah. We can still detect, we know that they're there, but they're just so mired in this dogmatic stuff and this, sketchy history and this abuse. But there's a seed, there's a purity there. There's something absolute. And I think that's why Pageau is going back to the church fathers, the early church fathers, 300 AD and later, that around then, and why John Vervaeke is going back to very similar Neoplatonism and Plato and Socrates and what
he's reading the church fathers too. Yeah. Yeah,
he's reading the church fathers too.
Regina.
So exactly. So what's going on there that we can get something out of? Because there was, let's just say you've got the agapic source that gives birth to the idea, let's just say, that gives birth to Christ as a, not just a person, but as Christ. I don't need to, describe it in what gives birth to Christ. What is that, or what is going on at that time, and what can we get from that? What is that seminal experience that we can maybe go back and rescue?
Yeah. Rescuing the bones of the Father.
Absolutely, and integrate it into where we are now in this technological universe we exist in, which we're not going to dispense with. It wouldn't make sense. I don't think even in the eyes of God, if we have, arrived at a point where we can offer a solution from low biological quality to all of mankind, that God would ever expect us to go back. But how do we reintegrate God into this? What is Pirsig's solution to low quality technology? How can you make the technology high quality? How can God come back into the machine?
I'm not sure if that's a question towards me. I mean, what I was just reading was that idea of focusing on quality, right?
Yeah.
Like seeing beyond the classical form.
Yeah.
To what unifies it and being aimed at that.
Yeah.
Is that what you've read? Because you've read a lot more deeply than me.
Well, I think that he's another way of describing what we're doing here.
Yeah.
So I don't think Pirsig is at odds. I think it's just a different way of describing a very similar thing. There's going to be variations, obviously. Yeah. There's going to be variations between some of these Neoplatonists, some of the early church fathers, Pirsig, everyone who has a good metaphysical understanding of reality, metaphysics that get close to the source. They're all going to have divergences. Tao is very, it's the Eastern variation of this. They're describing the same reality. I think the difference between the East and West, though, is there's something like, and this is what I think the distinction is. With Western metaphysics, you have a hierarchy. It's either in the center or it's at the top. In Eastern, it's more of a force that's driving you towards the good, and it's an inherent force that's taking you there. And in Western metaphysics, there's a good at the top, and you're aiming for it. Yeah. It's a subtle distinction, but I think that might be
sounds like the difference between a mountain and a river.
Something like that. And a mountain is a symbol of Western spirituality, and a river is a symbol of Eastern spirituality. Yeah. Absolutely.
had a conversation recently with one of my employees. He's my main kind of computer guy. He's a devoted Christian. He went to Oral Roberts University. And he's very interested in the Bible Project and kind of this idea. It's very much a reclamation of Christianity, trying to let go of dogmas that don't represent what the original church was about.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I was describing to him this sort of vision of the transformations that we're trying to help people with, and rooting it in an evolutionary frame, and like drawing it from the beginning all the way up from the evolutionary frame. And he was like, that's all perfectly congruent with the Christian vision.
Isn't that interesting?
And then I was saying, okay, well, but what about all this fundamentalism and the evangelicals? And he's like, well, that's where I came from. And no, that's not where I am anymore. Right. But it's still, it's more to him, it's more Christian where he is now. So I'm curious, you asked me where I'm at with my spiritual journey. Like, I remember I was listening to you in Pageau, I believe. Mm-hmm. And it seemed like you were still in a place where Christianity was a little bit further away than it is for Pageau. But when I'm hearing you now, it sounds like you've moved a little bit more towards Pageau's perspective.
I would say so. I would say that it's, I'm having trouble that, a very similar problem that you are is it looks like in practice right now, the only, if you are in this framework, then the only church is Orthodox. And that means that you have to get out of your, then that means that that's where you need to go if that's the type of Christian you want to be. And that is really, that's a commitment. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, I've been to the Orthodox Church twice. Uh-huh. And the local priest isn't a very good singer, which makes it a lot harder to do when you got to sit down for 2 hours of singing. Yeah, it's interesting. But I'm curious why you think it has to be Orthodox, because like Paul's in our space and he's a Protestant, and
Well, I'm saying that if you want to align with this metaphysics, then Orthodox Christianity is the option.
Yeah. That's what if you want to align with Pageau's metaphysics.
You want to align with Pageau's metaphysics, and yeah. I was baptized Episcopal, and occasionally I go to the Episcopal Church. Okay. There are things about Catholicism I like. I like some of the ritual. I like the fact that it's very imagistic. I'm oriented towards images, so I like that. But I'm still in that space where I just don't know where I want to go with this. I couldn't say I'm an atheist. I would say that I'm a believer. Okay. But as to practices, I'm really at an impasse.
Okay, interesting. So you believe, like, at a fundamental level, that Christ died and was resurrected.
I would say
physically came back from the dead.
No, I would say that I believe in God.
Okay.
And that's about the limit. That's about as far as I can go with it.
And what does God mean?
It is everything that we're talking about. I think I think it's something that's undefinable, and I think it's everything that we're saying.
Yeah. Do you think that maybe the word God itself is kind of got too many semantic hangups for what we're trying to capture, or is it the right word?
I think any word is going to have too many semantic hangups. I think that it's an ineffable thing.
It's interesting because I feel like, just the time that I grew up, right? I don't know how old you are, but I'm 39, right? And
I'm a lot older than you. I'm the same age as, I think Paul and I are the same age. Jordan's a little older than me.
So you're...
we're 57.
57. Okay, cool. So you grew up at a very different cultural moment. So I don't know as much about that cultural moment. It's post 60s, right? Mm-hmm. You're Gen X. You're what, mid Gen X?
I think I'm the last year of the boomers. I think.
You're last year of the boomers. Okay, interesting. So very different though. But for me, like what was occurring when I was in my formative years, right? when I'm just starting to come into consciousness of political, religious, theological realities, what's going on, right? Newt Gingrich is marching into taking over the House with the moral majority, right? Like everybody is the right is campaigning, against gay marriage. That's one of their big culture war issues that they're making a lot of hay against the left on. Creationism in schools is the big debate. And like most of the Christians I meet are like defenders of this fundamentalist. I've been saved by the Lord, God is a man in the sky with a white beard, right? And then you have Harris and Hitchens and Dawkins and Dennett, and they're like, this all doesn't make sense. I remember a website from the early era of the internet where they calculated how many people God killed in the Bible versus the devil. God kills like 500,000 people in the Old Testament, and the Bible kills 6 people, right? Or the devil. Like I cut my teeth on arguments like that on the internet, right? Talk origins. And so it's been very strange to first there was Peterson saying here's this conceptualization of God. And like he and Harris talking about that was like, they were just completely talking past each other, right? Harris just kept trying to turn Peterson into William Lane Craig, right?
Well, Harris operates in I know he has a spirituality, which is basically Advaita Vedanta, I think. Yeah. I can tell from the book. But he's not acknowledging anything beyond the measurable.
Yeah.
And that's, you're going to talk across purposes if you can do that. And the person, Peterson knows what Harris is talking about, but Harrison will never know what Peterson's talking about if he's still living in that space. It's so limited.
Yeah. So now we have Peterson, and then there's Pageau, and then there's Vervaeke. And it's like, if you start asking them about their conceptualization of God, it's not a angry man who lives in the sky.
No, in fact, if you look at Pageau, he's got a clip of what is. Mm-hmm. I hate using these words because they just
the ground of intelligibility, right? It's
exactly, and it is Platonic. It absolutely, it's not a man in the sky, and it's very interesting how they all come together on this.
It's interesting for me because I think I just need to understand the philosophy better, right? I
think that makes sense. What we need to, I think we're in a very similar space. Yeah. And I think understanding philosophy better, seeking, another word I hate, but being intellectually engaged and physically engaged like you are, and engaged in the community, and pursuing all these aspects and trying to make them as good as they can be. And in that pursuit, maybe the truth will be revealed to us. Maybe we just have to be patient and have it be revealed to us.
Yeah. It's not so easy to dismiss the God that Pageau describes. And to see someone like Vervaeke, who's a deeply scientific person, whose conceptualization of how his ontology is in many ways closer to Pageau's than it is to Harris's, right?
And edging more and more in that direction.
Yeah.
In the very sophisticated frame and intellectual and brilliant frame from which he operates.
It's like I have to take that seriously, but it's not an easy grounds to try to think from for someone who's as deeply rooted in kind of evolutionary biology and scientific epistemology as I am.
I hear you.
So
it's really ingrained,
Yeah. So that's where I'm at.
I understand.
Yeah.
I'm very, I'm in your camp. Cool. Well, I think that these things that are happening right now, and I'm happy that we're part of it, of this corner, and let's just say way up the hierarchy, we've had this amazing convergence of 4 approaches to this very problem that we're talking about: Pageau, Vervaeke, Bishop Barron, and MVP. Yeah. And this is the beginning of something really important,
Yeah. The four horsemen of meaning. We'll see. It'll be very interesting if they can dominate the intellectual landscape the way that the four horsemen of new atheism did.
Well, what, maybe it's the same, like Pageau was saying, the ground is fertile for this.
I think because religion is bubbling up in a way that cannot be denied.
B values precondition A. Yeah. Pirsig would say this is the ground of, this is where dynamic quality and where we are now are going to converge into something. And maybe this is one of the directions that, that we're going. And I just, my intuition says so.
Yeah. Well, it'll be interesting to continue to see.
It's so coherent, it's coherent. I mean, when you hear them talk, regardless of where we are in our spiritual journey, isn't there a coherence and a meshing of minds and something beautiful coming together that feels real, rather than like four guys, like maybe even 2 years ago, if they got together, it wouldn't be the same thing.
Yeah, there's something powerful happening in the space.
Something powerful happening, and I think that's really exciting to be part of it in our respective ways.
For sure. My children have just arrived home. It's going to get loud here in just a second. So we're going to have to stop there for today, Sevilla.
Well, it was a nice long conversation and I really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it was really good to connect and I look forward to future chats.
Absolutely.
Have a good day.
You too. Take care. Bye.
Hey, you've reached the end of another Evolve, Move, Play podcast. If you enjoyed what you heard, if you want to be involved in the conversation, please consider joining us in our new membership subscription so you can get access to question and answers with our live speakers once a month, question and answers with me once a month, and a dedicated forum to discuss everything going on in the podcast, as well as a general discussion of movement on our general movement forums. If you're interested in that, make sure to check out the link below, get signed up, and join a part of our membership community. If you can't join our membership community right now, it's still always helpful if you can like, share, and subscribe, and even hit that bell and get notifications for upcoming Evolve, Move, Play podcasts. But adios for now, and we'll see you next time. Thanks, guys.